Today on Sports Central, we go over our 2022 college football predictions for the Ole Miss Rebels, one of the top teams in the SEC in the 2021 season, as this team went 10-3 overall. But all this team being 2022, that's what we go over here today. We'll be analyzing this team and predicting their schedule game by game in this video, starting out with your team trends. Ole Miss 10-3 last season. This team was 5-1 their first 6 games, 5-2 in their last 7, and this team was very competitive in a brutal conference last season. They had several really good wins and took a couple of challenging losses, that's for sure. But I mean, in the end, it was a great season for the Rebels and definitely a step in the right direction for Ole Miss. This team lost to Alabama by 3 touchdowns on October 2nd there, but in October, this team had several good wins. Otherwise, they beat Arkansas 52-51. That was quite a matchup there between the Razorbacks and Ole Miss there. On October 9th, and we also saw them beat Tennessee on the road 31-26, beat LSU 31-17, and also beat Texas A&M, which was a huge win there, 29-19. Played Baylor in the Sugar Bowl, but ended up losing that game there 7-21, and I think a big part of the reason why Ole Miss couldn't win that matchup was because, of course, Matt Corral getting injured. In the end, that was a tough injury and a tough guy to lose, especially if you're wanting to win a big-time bowl game like that. And Baylor, in the end, did get the win, even though offensively, I mean, it was very tough for Ole Miss to score points in that one. But nonetheless, bottom line, it was still a great season for Ole Miss. Getting up to 10 wins is no easy thing to do. I think this team is in the right, they're going in the right direction heading into 2022, even though this team is going to look a whole lot different going into next season. Matt Corral, starting quarterback, he's gone. He was a big reason why this team had so much success last season, and why. There were some expectations for Ole Miss going into last year because of Matt Corral and him returning, as well as the talent around him. Matt Corral last year, he didn't disappoint. Put up 3,300 yards of passing, 20 touchdowns, 5 picks, and a 68% completion rate. Those are his passing stats. He also rushed for over 600 yards and 11 touchdowns on the ground last year. So, Matt Corral, he was a great quarterback last season, and so it's going to be tough having him gone, but you do bring in Jackson Dart, the 5-star out of high school, the USC transfer as well. And Jackson Dart, he played a little bit in 2021 for the Trojans. Really, his performance was pretty underwhelming when he played for USC last season. His stats weren't great, but I feel like that was just his first season playing in college, so we haven't really seen too much of him yet. I am optimistic about Jackson Dart, and I feel like, going from the Pac-12 to the SEC is quite a jump, because the Pac-12, the SEC is an incredibly difficult and challenging and competitive conference versus, say, the Pac-12. But so yeah, Jackson Dart coming in, he's very likely to start from what it looks like, but of course, there's obviously going to be a quarterback battle still there. Backfield is a concern for me. You got Jerrion Ely, who's gone. You lose Snoop Connor, and you also have Henry Parrish Jr., who's transferring out. So you do lose your top 3 in the backfield from last season. Ely last season put up nearly 1,000 yards, 7 touchdowns. Snoop Connor over 700 yards and 13 touchdowns, and Henry Parrish Jr. put up over 500 yards of rushing and over 700 of total offense and 3 touchdowns. So losing them 3, it's going to be a challenge. The backfield is going to be much more inexperienced going into next season, which does concern me a bit. The receiving core, you also lose your top 3 in the receiving core: Dontario Drummond, Braylon Sanders, and Ja'Cour Pearson. And of course, if you look at Drummond, over 1,000 yards of offense, 9 touchdowns. Sanders over 500 yards of offense. You lose some talent in the skill players positions, that is for sure. And there's no doubt that this team is they're going to be younger next season, and that could mean that this team, it's more of a rebuilding season in 2022. But I feel like this team, I still feel like, even though they're losing so much talent, I really think, we saw this team perform. I'd say this team overperformed last season. I expected 7 to 9 wins out of this team, and this team turned out 10 and almost 11. So, it was a good season for Ole Miss, and I feel like the coaching, once again, I think it's really good with this team. You can tell, by the performances and by how this team performed, plus all the players sticking around and a couple of transfers coming in. The coaching is great for Ole Miss, and it's just a lot of experienced players being lost for this team going into next season. But you do lose 2 on the offensive line, 2 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and 3 in the secondary. So defensively, you do lose 7 of your key players, which is also a concern. But for Ole Miss, I will say this. Looking at their schedule is extremely I mean, it's extremely favorable for this team to do well with their schedule. The schedule is great, and I'll explain why in just a little bit here. But looking at your transfer portal and recruiting now going into next season, Jackson Dart, obviously the big standout in the transfer portal coming in from USC. You also bring in Jared Ivey from Georgia Tech. You do bring in several key players from the transfer portal, I will say that. So you do add some good depth from the transfer portal despite losing a lot of your key players from last season. You do lose Smith, defensive back, who's off to Kentucky. Be bringing a couple of tight ends there. You got one coming in from Auburn, one coming in from USC. Michael Trigg is the one coming in from USC. Knight, defensive back, he's off to Southern Miss, and you bring in Troy Brown and Mason Brooks, a linebacker from Central Michigan, and Mason Brooks, a defensive tackle from Western Kentucky. Otherwise, you got Kari Coleman coming in, edge rusher from TCU. Jacoby Moore is coming in from Mississippi State, a receiver there. So you had some from the receiving core, or for the receiving core. Ulysses Bentley, a running back who's coming in from SMU, but you lose Luke Knox, who's in the transfer portal right now. Jalen Robinson's coming in from UCF, receiver, but you lose Jernigan, and you bring in Deshaun Jerkins from Vanderbilt, and then Malik Heath is coming in from Mississippi State. Recruiting-wise, pretty good, 23rd in the nation, but 10th in the SEC. The SEC has been, just outstanding with their 2022 classes. I mean, Ole Miss is 23rd in the nation, but 10th in the SEC. You got 7 4-stars coming in and 11 3-stars. But that's it. Let's look at your schedule now going into next season. And as I mentioned before, I mean, this schedule is, I would say, extremely favorable for the Rebels. You got Troy and Central Arkansas in your first 2 games, both extremely winnable matchups. Then you got a road trip to Georgia Tech there as your Power 5 non-conference game. But Georgia Tech is, pretty terrible. They're a bottom feeder in the ACC and one of the worst in the Power 5, and I don't expect that to really change going into next season. Then you got Tulsa at home after that, then Kentucky as your first conference game at home. So you get to play one of your tougher opponents there at home. You got Vanderbilt on the road, then Auburn coming to town, then LSU, Texas A&M both on the road, and then Alabama at home, Arkansas on the road, and then Mississippi State at home on a Thursday night to finish out your season. So that said, let's look at your September here, your first month of action. Troy, Central Arkansas, both easy wins, and then Georgia Tech on the road. I'm going to put that Georgia Tech game in yellow just because it's on the road, but I do think, Ole Miss, I'm going to favor the Rebels all the way there. Tulsa, easy win as well. So I think, for Ole Miss, this team, despite, that's the kind of the thing is, when you go into a season and you've lost a lot of talent from your previous season, typically what happens is a team will have a tough start or a slow start, lose a couple of games that they shouldn't be in September. But I feel like it just sets up great for this team. Your September is extremely easy, and I feel like that's a good thing for Ole Miss if they want to have a successful season, is to have a good first month of action to kind of set the tone for the season and build some momentum as you head into your tough conference schedule. So you're in good shape heading to October. I feel like you got Kentucky. If Kentucky was on the road, I'd favor the Wildcats there. But Kentucky, I think you knock off the Wildcats there, which would be a huge win. I don't see Kentucky losing too many games next season. And then you beat Vanderbilt on the road by a couple of touchdowns. You also beat Auburn. So you start the season 7-0, which is certainly not something I typically predict considering the amount of talent that Ole Miss is losing from last season. But I feel like the schedule sets up perfectly for this team to at least get to 6-0. That Auburn game, potentially, that's a game you could slip up there. But you got them at home. You got them where you want them. So, I think you beat Auburn there, and that's a winnable game as well. So then you go into your last 5 games, which are brutal to say the least. Your first 7 games are, I'd say, all extremely winnable, but those last 5, that's where things get tough. LSU on the road. I think LSU is a winnable game. You could definitely beat the Tigers, but I do think LSU does beat you there. They got the home field advantage. I do think they win that matchup, even though it certainly would be a close one. Then Texas A&M the week after that, you lose to them. I'm more confident that you lose to Texas A&M than LSU. I do think the Aggies next season are a 10-11 win team. I'd say 9-11. Yeah, probably the 9-11 win range there for Texas A&M. So I do have them getting the win there. So you're 7-2 heading into November. You got Alabama and Arkansas, 2 tough games there. You lose both of them. I think Alabama is a winnable matchup. You got them at home, but Crimson Tide, they're gonna win that matchup, I do think, in the end. Even though Ole Miss does have the home field there. And they got Arkansas on the road after a brutal, that's just a really tough stretch there of games. between LSU and Arkansas. You do have a bye week in the middle there between Texas A&M and Alabama games, which is to your benefit there. But I do think in the end, you lose to both Alabama and Arkansas. So you're on a 4-game losing streak heading into that Mississippi State matchup. I do think that you beat the Bulldogs in that matchup on that Thursday night. That's on Thanksgiving, I think. But I mean, in the end, Mississippi State, I feel like that's a winnable game. You got them at home. You're going to get the win there in a close one, which is, I mean, that game's pretty much a coin toss for me. I think Mississippi State is pretty similar to the level that Ole Miss I'm expecting for next season, which is 8-4 for the Rebels. So I think if you can get up to 8 wins next season, get to a bowl game, win a bowl game, you're in really good shape. I think that's a good season for this team, considering how more inexperienced they're going to be next season versus how they were in 2021. So if you get up to 8 wins, that is, I think, a really great scenario, and that sets you up well for the future. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below on Ole Miss, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.